could upend things from Ukraine to China, and having potentially a first female president of the United States, and a woman of color could also, shift things up. So my question is, how could either a Kamala Harris 1.0 or Trump 2.0 change things for the future, and how should New Zealand prepare? Because to my view, the first time Donald Trump got elected, New Zealand wasn't really taking it seriously. So how to avoid any surprises and get ready as a small country at the bottom of the world?
Well, clearly the United States is divided down the middle, and it's quite, possible that you'll get a result where a candidate wins the popular vote and loses the electoral college. Either way, so it's a toss-up, and as we know, it's a few hundreds of thousands of votes in a few strategic counties and states which are going to make the difference. My next point, though, would be that sadly, I think on some of the key issues of concern to us, the differences may not be as great as they seem. For example, the antagonism to China, the strategic contestation, seems set to continue under either administration, unless with Kamala Harris's vice president, who has spent quite a bit of time in China and knows people, as colleagues and friends, unless after the elections, a completely different foreign policy team and a different way of thinking about how to relate to China as a major emerging power. Secondly, on Ukraine, I'm totally in Ukraine's corner, right? I'm devastated by what has happened to Ukraine. I do happen to think that whoever wins, Ukraine will come under huge pressure to settle wherever the line of control is. And that's why this summer and autumn fighting has been so critical for Ukraine, not to lose more, because clearly major European countries like Germany are sick of paying for it. The Americans, heavily indebted as they are probably sick of paying for it as well. And at some point, I think either the Trump administration or a Harris one, Ukraine will come under pressure to settle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a peace settlement. I think we're acutely aware that an armistice has run in the Korean War since 1953 without a peace settlement. But I can't see Ukraine continuing to be armed the way it is, and I feel for them. Thirdly, on Israel-Palestine, which is rather interesting, I think President Trump prides himself on the art of the deal. He really prizes the Saudi Arabia relationship. He's been very much in Israel's corner, but he keeps saying he wants a deal. Can't go on like this. So, what is he thinking of? Secondly, when I was in New York, moving around, listening to people, what I was told, what I heard, was that the team around Kamala Harris are very concerned about the way the US has handled the Israel-Palestine conflict, including over the past almost year since 7th October. Of course, nothing can be said now because it may fuel Trump's rhetoric. But it's possible that we might see a more muscular approach to from the US on the issues, because at the moment it looks like Israel's the superpower and the US is trotting along behind saying me too. It reminds you of that old story about Bill Clinton after one of, no doubt, a number of unsatisfactory meetings with Netanyahu, when Clinton said to his aides at the end of the meeting, "Who the hell is the superpower around here?" Well, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Objectively. I mean, they arm Israel, they've supported it for years, but somehow have no influence. This is not sustainable.
Yes. I mean, that shows that sort of dictum, all foreign policy starts at home and domestic politics matters. And I think in the case of Israel-Palestine, it's absolutely the case with the United States. I will just thinking now, I know we've only got about 10 minutes left, but thinking about New Zealand and what we can represent, Aotearoa New Zealand can strive to represent globally, and kind of looking forward a bit more. Where do you think, if we look over the next 10, 15 years, what would be a good role for New Zealand? And what would the international, like an ideal international system look like? What should we strive to work towards?
So I think we need to think about where we've been successful in the past. I would think the independent New Zealand foreign policy probably got its greatest boost from the nuclear-free policy. And let's not think the nuclear disarmament issues have gone away. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has that, minutes to midnight clock moving ever closer. So we should really get back into the frame on the discussions around nuclear weapons, which is a clear and present threat. President Putin's threatened them, the use in Ukraine and around, as has some of his acolytes. I think if we're looking at those sort of treaties around, quote, weapons of mass destruction, the Biological Weapons Convention is weak, much weaker than, say, the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we might, put a bit of effort into that. I think this whole arms control architecture is extremely important, and it's come under a lot of pressure from the time of the Trump presidency and now the Putin reaction with what's happened in Ukraine. So the last thing we need is an unraveling arms control infrastructure. I think on trade, obviously New Zealand's long punched above its weight on that, but our international trading system's also in some dysfunction. Not least because our great friend the United States has undermined the appellate system, which, and if you don't have a proper appeal system, then that tends to paralyze the organization. So some creative thinking about how to get WTO negotiations back on track. It's absurd to think that the hard yards on the only existing trade round of the old GATT that succeeded was the Uruguay one, which the legwork was mostly done on when Mike Moore was a trade minister at the end of 1980s. So, I mean, and now the World Trade Rules system doesn't cover, basically the last 3 decades plus of what's happened in the global economy. So that's a bit irrelevant. I think, look, if you had a blank sheet of paper, wouldn't I love to see New Zealand in the Southern Hemisphere as a companion country to Norway in the Northern one, which was known for its dedication to bringing people together to broker agreements and peace. That Don McKinnon did this very successfully with Burnham, the Burnham talks between the Bougainvilleans and Papua New Guinea back in the late 90s. But it's not something we put a lot of effort into. It would be nice to think of us as an honest broker, but to be an honest broker, you also have to be seen to be independent. And I'm on the record as saying that I am very concerned about the slippage away from the independent and principled foreign policy and the slippage back into being a sort of yes sir, where Uncle Sam goes, we go kind of mentality. So I think to be credible and putting ourselves forward as an honest broker, we have to really safeguard the independent stance.
Yes.
So talking about foreign policy, what was the best foreign policy decision you have made during your career as a prime minister?
Oh, without question, not being involved in the invasion of Iraq.
Yes.
And it's not that it wasn't sounded out with us, but we used our own judgment. Independent sources of information at high levels, including in the UN system. When I went to see Kofi Annan at the end of 2002, he was very clear to me, as were his senior officials, including Hans Blix, former Swedish Conservative PM who ran the arms verification mission, the head of political affairs, Sir Kieran Prendergast, that there was no legal foundation for an invasion. And we took that advice rather than, the whispering in our ear from across the ditch, London and Washington, D.C. And, time proved us right. It was not supported by the major opposition in New Zealand at the time. They condemned it. But that decision has stood the test of time. Out of the complete disarray in Iraq following the invasion, where one of the first things the invading force did was disband the Ba'ath Party and disband the Iraqi army, particularly when you disband the power control systems in a country, you leave a vacuum, and the vacuum was eventually led to ISIS. Not to put too fine a point on it, the invasion of Mosul, the terrible things that happened to the Yazidis, ISIS then, of course, its influence through Syria and Iraq as well. Dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. And the legacy of that's still playing out in those wretched detention camps where the ISIS widows and families are absolutely trapped and can't leave and have no prospects at all. So without doubt, the best decision was not to have a bar of it.
Well, that's a really interesting, and I know Terence O'Brien, my father, spoke a lot about that time as well, and effectively the importance of having an independent view. I wonder.
And upcoming at Diplo's Fair, you'll see these events. We have Trump 2.0 versus Harris 1.0. How should New Zealand prepare? Then the worldly woman of Wellington through the eyes of Australia, India, Turkey, Argentina, and Ireland. Join us at Diplo's Fair.